Welcome, friends, to this presentation on queer callings, archival callings, a conversation with Mark Jordan and Lynne Gerber. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Brings us to tonight. We are pleased to present what should be a provocative, insightful conversation from Mark Jordan's newest publication, Queer Callings, Untimely Notes on Names and Desires, from Fordham University Press. As Lynne and Mark have predicated, we who engage queer texts, figures, and histories dwell with archives. What in them calls out to us? What do we look for in them? How do we hear what we find there? In this conversation, Mark and Lynne will discuss archival intimacies, from the electrifying to the muffled or incomplete, and the speech and bodies they conjure, resist, or refuse. Mark Jordan, PhD, is a longtime reader of Christian theology, European philosophy, and gender studies. Before his retirement from Harvard Divinity School, Mark taught courses on the traditions of Christian soul shaping, the relations of religion to art and literature, and the current prospects for sexual ethics. He continues to write spiritual histories of queer living in the United States. Lynne Gerber, PhD, is an independent scholar in San Francisco. Her interests lie at the intersections of religion, the body, and morality. She's the author of Seeking the Straight and Narrow, Weight Loss and Sexual Reorientation in Evangelical America. Her current work is on religious engagements with HIV/AIDS in the 1980s and 90s Bay Area, with a particular focus on the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions at any time in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to your questions during a Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. And if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay on after the webinar has concluded, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Wasadi, who is the tech manager for our program. Now, I am pleased to welcome Lynne Gerber and Mark Jordan to this discussion of queer callings, archival callings.
Hello.
Hello.
I call it you through Zoom. I call queerly through Zoom.
Welcome to you all, you invisible presences, you invisible spirits. I hope to get to see at least some of you later. My deep thanks to the Religious Archives Network for hosting this conversation. As my fellow Mark said, there will be time at the end for your comments and questions. But my exchange with Lynne will already be conversation, not magisterial disquisition. Having spent 7 years wrestling with this book's words, I hardly want to hide them behind a tidy summary. Instead, Lynne and I will pursue questions that encircle the book, questions about our relations to and with queer archives. No summary then, yet I hesitate to leave you utterly adrift, so I'll do my best to pronounce some introduction. The book is a convocation, a calling together of queer voices around two puzzles. Hold on to the notion of voices, which justifies the book's style and approach to archives. First puzzle. When did people begin to talk about their bodily lives, their loves and desires, their fluctuating selves as sexual identity and gender identity? What did they mean by identity as applied to sex gender? The book fuses the words sex and gender for historical accuracy, but also to resist the segregation of trans issues. Brief answers to this first puzzle. Sexual identity and gender identity, coined for US clinics during the mid-1950s, spread fast into political, journalistic, and church contexts starting around 1970. As for what people intended by the word identity, their intentions are neither clear nor coherent. We can apply to identity Foucault's epithet for the word sodomy, that so confused category. Recalling sodomy also highlights an important reversal in Christian theology's relation to expert terminology for sex gender. If sodomy was a theological category circulated into criminal law, natural science, and cultural fantasy, identity is a socio-clinical term that spreads into movement politics and is then picked up too eagerly, too uncritically by Christian theologians. This points to larger confusions around theology's subordination to revolutionary projects. For me, theology's limits cannot be set by political usefulness because long-term political effects are unknowable and because theology's hopes exceed our politics. So do theology's languages. Queer Callings scrutinizes the origin of sex-gender identities in order to get at a second puzzle. Are there resonant languages for sex gender that identity displaced? What could we learn now by rehearsing or reperforming those languages from recent decades with their analogies and metaphors, quotations and variations, their seductions and laments? The second puzzle is the more interesting for me because many of the displaced languages explicitly link queer living to a spirituality expressed in mythologies, bodily disciplines, poetries, and religions. Queer Callings samples several dozen voices that speak queerness against identity. Some of the samples are taken from obvious sources: Oscar Wilde, Mary Daly, Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Maggie Nelson. Others are perhaps not so obvious: Juna Barnes, Jeff Maines, Judy Grahn, Sally Gearhart, Samuel Delaney, Marilyn Hacker. Over the polyphony of these voices, I float like the soprano line of a house anthem, queer advice about how to listen for lost languages. The advice comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein and Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. But you may be wondering, why all this emphasis on words? One introductory answer might be, the terms and plots we use to classify and narrate ourselves are an intimate point of contact between prevailing forms of power and mortal bodies. Also then, an obvious point for resistance. Another answer might be, queer communities, always in the plural, are linguistic groups at least as much as they are political movements or erotic marketplaces. Instead of essentializing identities or biologizing social structures, we might present ourselves as among those who speak queer, adding at once that queer has never been a single language. You've already heard that my sources consist largely of texts preserved in archives. You may have concluded rightly that the book's structure mirrors the shelves of a community-based collection. So let me end this little introduction with an archival testimony. In 1977, Michel Foucault published a short text, usually mistranslated as The Lives of Infamous Men. In it, he reports feeling a physical intensity of vibration when encountering certain archived records. In one case, the sensation arose suddenly across 2.5 centuries of silence to agitate in his body more fibers than were stirred by what is ordinarily called literature. Many of us have felt similar intensities, vibrations, agitations. But Foucault is not finished. He reminds us that his encounters came through preserved words. Embodied lives rendered in a fistful of words become strange poems. Responding to such encounters, Foucault urges, we should strive to preserve the effect of each record, each life. How much more, I would add, when the archived words and lives are marked by spirit. Lynn, over to you.
All right. That was quite, for all the talk of non-magisterial, that was quite magisterial. I will be more chatty, as is my way. And I will start by saying, so folks know that Mark and I are longtime friends and longtime conversation partners who have been circling around and around questions of queer stories and lives and histories for many, many years. And so we see this as an extension of our longtime conversation. Some of you have been part of that conversation. Some of you have hosted that conversation. Some of you were the inspiration for that conversation. So it's a privilege and really an honor to be here in celebration of this new book. Mark and I come from very different disciplinary perspectives, which is part of the fire of our conversation. I am trained as a qualitative sociologist. I do something that looks a little bit more like traditional history than what Mark does, and that Mark is sometimes quite suspicious of for good reason. And because this is an event for LGBT RAN and so focused on archives, many of my questions will take this book more from an archival or methodological perspective than going head on to the argument. So that's kind of what I'm circling around here and thinking about. So the first question that I have is that for me reading this book, there seems to be a fundamental tension between, so the book is an argument against identity, right? It feels inspired in part by the just utter offense you take at the closed quality of identity, the way it constrains, the way it narrows, the way it tries to fix. And it's clear that you hate that. And it really just, it is a beautiful and multifaceted and kind of just delightful set of resistances to that closure. But you tell us it is not another op-ed. It is a dream recital of imaginary languages. And what that looks like in the book is this incredible stylistic methodological approach that, as you say, is like, it's like house music. It's based on what you call textual collage, or a set of juxtapositions that in my reading are an effort to kind of disrupt the fixity of identity and expand our imaginations to sort of think beyond the ways in which identity has taken such a clamping down, position in our brains, and like have this wild juxtaposition of languages and possibilities to just disrupt us and get us out of that. But the book also has a warning and and some lessons and um, some suggestions about how we learn languages and how hard it is to do when you are sitting in an archive to truly learn the languages that we're talking about. You write, there's a couple of places. There's one place you write, a reminder to academic historians, knowledge about words is not yet habitation to their meanings, which are their uses. So it's not just what it's learning these languages is not just understanding the words, it's about having enough knowledge of the place and time from which they emerge to be able to understand their uses. In my discipline, it's about habitus and truly deeply understanding the habitus of the place and the people that we're studying and trying to learn from and that we're sitting in the archive with, to be able to, in another place that you write, not just know the appropriate emotional response to a text that we're looking to evoke for a poem to evoke a blush, which is something you write about. But it's for those of us who are, like in your book, a little stony and don't have that kind of immediate response to the languages that you're examining, we have to learn to know that we are supposed to blush at certain moments, and then yet another step to just spontaneously blush. That kind of learning and knowledge and situating in those language spaces is one of such time and attention. And to me, and in reading it, I just felt this tension between what feels to me like a long, deep, necessary habituation to any one language, not to mention the wild range to which you expose us for this purpose of disruption. And I wonder what you think about that, especially in relationship to those of us who are going to archives to try to learn how to tell histories and stories and learn to hear lost languages and the time that it takes to do so. And also to readers, particularly undergraduates or more newcomer readers who may not have the kind of breadth of exposure to the kind of language that you so clearly master in the book.
Powerful series of questions, close to my heart. Let me say a few things and then maybe ask a question back. I think learning languages is one of the most enigmatic and ethically hopeful things that human beings can do, because I think that our ability to learn languages across cultural divisions and social divisions allows for a human connection that's tremendously hopeful and important. But look, you never finish learning a language. You never finish learning your mother tongue. I mean, I get lessons about English every time I sit down to write or read. So I don't regard myself as having an accomplished mastery of anything I write about, nor do I think that I write with accomplished mastery. It's true that I would not have had the courage to write this book when I was 25 or 45. But that's also largely because many of us are cruelly formed by academic institutions that constantly excite our anxieties about what we don't know, instead of saying to us, you're never going to know what you want to know. You're never going to know these languages. Just wade in. Because my experience in the archives is that each Hollinger box you get, each folder you pull out of the box, each sheet of paper in the folder may present you with a new language. And you learn the languages you need as you go along, right? Like when you hit a new author, you learn the language of that author in this text as you go along. Is it necessary to have a certain introduction? Yes. The introductions, though, will always have gaps in them and probably mistakes. Both my first attempt to do the history of categories for sexuality, the invention of sodomy, and this book began by realizing that part of what I thought I knew was mistaken. I thought I knew that where the word sodomy came from. I'd read it in the encyclopedias and the dictionaries, but they were wrong. I thought I had a rough idea where the notion of identity began to figure in queer speech. I thought it was in the 1890s, probably. No, that's wrong. It's much later than that. So in both cases, it seems to me it's what I learned was it's our ability to pick up language on the fly, to pick up language while we're in the archives that matters. And it's the willingness to correct your own presumptions that matters. But this is closely related to, Lynne, to what you singled out rightly as my suspicion of history, by which I mean not the telling of tales about the past, which is absolutely essential. What I'm suspicious of are narratives that pretend to be definitive or complete. Do we share that suspicion?
Yeah. Oh, completely.
Good.
Yes.
Because, yeah, I would, because one of the things that I suspect we share is also a commitment to telling, to collaging or putting together the necessarily incomplete histories that emerge from both printed archives and from interviews of the kind you conduct, and that you, by the way, taught me how to conduct with people, because I was used to dealing with texts, not living beings. What a frightening thought, talking to living beings.
They're amazing and terrifying.
They are. They are. But there too, would you agree? There too, I at least had the experience of talking to someone who is roughly my age from the same demographic background and figuring out, oh, wait, I don't understand how this person is using the language. I have to learn, as it were, the indigenous vocabulary of this person in order to conduct the interview.
Yeah, or you have to use the interview as the occasion to learn that indigenous language and give up the pretense to knowledge, which I think you write about in different contexts in the book so persuasively, but your suspicion of knowingness. I think going into an interview and allowing the person that you're interviewing to teach you and have that be the premise of the interview itself, in fact, to fully take on the space of not knowingness and allow yourself to be taught is super different than how I was trained in some contexts. But I think it's definitely the way to train that ear, to train that blushing mechanism, to train that habitus, to allow yourself to sort of to move, to enter other people's speech and sort of move along. There's still, of course, plenty you don't hear and you don't know to hear. And because people speak so many different streams of languages. So like in the case of my work with MCC San Francisco, people speak a certain kind of gay lesbian language and a certain set and this huge range of religious languages. And as somebody not raised in the Christian tradition, every single one of them is new to me. So the fights over the things or what song is going to evoke what in what person in the audience, which is what I know the people who created that church so mindfully organize, but I can't always hear. It like allowing yourself, it is a sort of, I mean, it's a submission really to the languages, the speech, the sound, what you hear, what you read, and letting it take you over. But there, as you say, there are always gaps. And I think all of us, I mean, I will speak for myself, but many people I know live in the anxious place of the mistakes of what's her name? Naomi Wolf, oh, hey, you just didn't know that? You just didn't know what that phrase meant in that book you wrote that whole thing about? Like I think all knowledges of languages are incomplete, but it is also possible to speak too soon to them in terms of us as scholars and writers and thinking about these things. And I think it's part of the anxiety and tension of my question, I guess, or my endless pondering about this place.
I think that's right. But I would also say, I mean, when when collegial conversation or peer reviewing work the way they're supposed to, they help us to see where we've made howlers, where we've really just tripped over our own feet. Marie Griffith did that to me very kindly, very gently, because I was not raised as an evangelical and do not know the evangelical hymnody. And so when I was discussing with her a chapter I had written on Anita Bryant, and I thought I had done my homework tracking down the source of language in Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant uses very importantly, very prominently, the phrase "trust and obey." And Marie looked at me and said, "You do know that's a hymn, don't you?"
I know it's a hymn.
Yes, that's right. I didn't. And that was a gracious example of collegial teaching, of a kind that we, I think, should be willing to receive, but also willing to provide without embarrassment. Without embarrassment. The idea that you can only write when you know everything, that's never been true. It's impossible.
Yeah.
But I'd also pick out something you said, which is very interesting to me. I mean, my experience, it really struck me when I was reading a series of questionnaires that were done for a Mattachine survey in San Francisco in 1964, if I remember correctly. And these were private surveys. There was never any plan to publish them as such. And they should have been destroyed, right, according to contemporary regulations. But I found the file in which they were all kept. One thing that occurred to me in reading through them was that in many cases, I could go through and footnote the phrases that had the phrases of clinical speech, of American Freudianism, of church preaching, of homophobic rhetoric that had entered into the language of the queer men who were filling these interview forms out. And that was a vivid reminder to me that much of the language that we speak is cliche. That is to say, it's borrowed language. And sometimes we know the borrowing, we recognize it, and sometimes we don't. But that ability also to hear not just what's being said, but to hear what in an interview or what in a private letter represents unconsciously borrowed language, sometimes very homophobic language, sometimes very damaging interpretations of scripture or of Christian doctrine or whatever, to be able to recognize that and then to try to listen between the cliches for the spark of originality, variation, improvisation in the language. That, I think, is the kind of moment in which, when that begins to happen for me, that's the moment in which I feel like, oh, I've now entered into the idiolect, the private language of this person.
I don't know if this is the same thing as what you're talking about, but what it makes me think of is when I'm listening to tapes of MCC services in the 80s and the 90s, I've thought a lot about this. When cliche, or for lack of a better word, a certain kind of Christian kitsch, a certain kind of hymn, for example, that has a kind of cliche quality or a kind of what some would critique as a sentimentalism or that kind of thing, becomes a whole new thing in this moment because it's done in this queer church, in this time, in this city, with this afflicting this community. And it becomes, it feels to me, the feeling I have is that some very rote sounding song just opens up a whole nother dimension that's able to hold something that something less cliche can't quite hold. And it's something about the ongoing use that in a moment becomes the thing that can hold, that can contain the loss, the fear, the questions, the confusion. It closes right up. It opens up a dimension, then it kind of closes right up, but you can kind of hear it. And I have a question of that in relation to identity and sort of your critique about it, in part because I think of, I'm with you on your critique of it mostly the whole way, and yet I reserve the space for the way in which identity can hold and be a foothold in some time and some places, that it can be a container that that you nod to. But I would love to hear your thinking more about the sort of the possible uses of identity that aren't about calcification, but they're about sufficient structure to move in a certain kind of a way. Do you know what I'm asking?
Let me try. I mean, first of all, I need to be clear that, as I say in the book, as you know, I'm only talking about the phrases sexual identity and
Yeah.
gender identity.
Mhm.
I'm not. I mean, I think it's a great mistake to treat all uses of identity as identical, right? That would be like repeating the mistake all over again.
Mhm.
So I'm only interested in these very particular phrases, and I'm aware, tenderly, I hope, aware that for some people, the claim, this is my sexual identity or this is my gender identity, is very important. And I hardly, it's the opposite of what I want to do, to take away from people what they've found to anchor their lives to, or what they've found in a hostile world to give them support. And I remember the story from class when I was talking about these things, and one of my students said, he was very upset, and he said, 2 nights ago in Manhattan at my pastoral internship, I was sitting at the bedside of a young man who was dying from AIDS. And this, by the way, was recent. This is, after AIDS was supposed to have been controlled, right? Whatever that means. And he said, all he has in this world is his queer identity. Stand back, kneel beside the bed and lament. But still, that for me is a sadness. It's a sadness that queer, I would say that queer politics and some structures of queer social life have made that the only possible language in which to speak the truths, the complex, fluctuating truths of our embodied lives. I don't want to take that away from him or from anyone who wants to hold it. I just want to say, could I offer you 6 other ways of talking? Or could I help you find in your own memory, in your own experience, other ways of talking about it? Why? Because the use of the word identity for sex and gender plays too directly into biopower, into the reigning powers over our bodies. Can you queer language that has been imposed upon you by your enemies? Yes, I think you can. I think you can. And there's sometimes when I use the word faggot, I describe myself as a faggot precisely to show that you can do that, even with very hurtful words. But I don't believe that what Foucault calls reverse discourse, that taking the language of your enemies and your oppressors and turning it around, I don't believe that that's the only or the richest way of speaking the truth of what you're living. Does that make any sense?
It makes total sense. And I'm thinking about it again in relationship to this hymn example, because in some ways that is an example of the language of the oppressor and reversing it in some perspectives, at least. And when I think about it methodologically in terms of looking at the archives, it's a valid and important critique in how to make lives. But there's also that reading skill, that habitus, that attunement to when identity speak is that kind of rote or cliched or foreclosed or fundamentally held or used as solely as political maneuvering position. And this place is where it opens up a world, and the space where it is a space of possibility, because it's not, I don't think it's uniformly, historically at least, for some actors in some moments, of a language that forecloses possibility. I think that's happened in time. And I think that's what happens with language so often in time, that what is evocative, what becomes a language of possibility in one moment becomes a language of foreclosure in another moment. And again, I think it's a little bit of it's a question I have in terms of, like, yeah, I think today, 2023, particularly in our academic contexts and our social contexts, the way language, identity language forecloses, for sure. But in archives, to hear the moment where that's actually a language of possibility, and to know it, I think it's part of the kind of multilingualism that you speak about that we have to learn, that languages don't necessarily essentially foreclose or open up opportunity. It's all a movement and a process, it seems to me.
I think that's true, but it seems to me also important to say that the phrases sexual identity and gender identity have very problematic origins in a really risky combination of social psychology, Erik Erikson, and then people like John Money and Thomas Colley, who's someone I write about.
And Elizabeth Moberly, very troubling.
Yes, yeah. And she's the recovery, right? She's the restoration movement. But what you're pointing to is that between, say, 1955 and 1970, the notion of identity, of homosexuality or gay identity or lesbian identity had for some people become important. At the very same time, for other people in queer communities, there was a very strong critique of the use of the word identity. And what's curious to me is that, people who will quote Foucault as if Foucault had written scripture, or Judith Butler as if gender trouble fell from the heavens into our hands, don't seem to realize that they mount very strong critiques of the notion of identity, identity language.
Before yours, I mean, Judith Butler, whose quote I'm going to completely mess up, but was my favorite, which she wrote that thing, about the utility of the word lesbian for organizing or not. She's like, as long as we are permanently unsure about what exactly it means, sure, call me a lesbian, fine. In terms of like a strategic use of it, but as long as we all agree that we have no idea what the hell it is. Yeah, I thought of that quote came to me a lot when I was reading your work and this book, and thinking about identity in that way and those critiques. I just think it's also a reminder that a sense of possibility isn't always uniformly to be trusted, even if we feel it. It can be used in a lot of ways,
Yes. And you reminded me, I was looking down at, because I had run across a quotation from the French. He's usually listed as one of the great French liberationists. I mean, he was a Marxist who contributed to some of the early French publications and organizing drives and so on, Guy Hockenheim. And so this is a great liberationist writing in 1977 who says, our homosexuality is not a revolutionary value that must be extended to the whole world, but a permanent situation of putting into question, a permanent situation of putting into question. But I also, and as you know, part of the reason I wrote the book was that I have this strong feeling that, more than a feeling, I'm heartbroken that so many gorgeous queer languages have been pushed to the side in what seems to me a kind of flat-footed political effort to standardize our speech. And so
Yeah.
my effort to bring in some of those languages, especially, my favorite lesbian separatist science fiction writers and my favorite lesbian poets who are writing and publishing on hand-run presses along Valencia Street, that's beautiful language that should not have just been discarded as kind of retrograde or not helpful to the movement or not clear or not meme worthy or whatever. And so part of it is also an attempt to restore these rich echoes of language.
Yeah, it's a mighty task. We have some questions. I'm going to raise them. One is, an audience member asks if you could speak briefly about the history of these troubling origins of these identity categories.
The most troubling to me are the actual clinical, psychological, clinical origins. And I mean, it's always tricky, looking for the first use of a word and so on. But all I can say is using all of the computer databases available to me, sexual identity in our sense of the term is very deliberately brought into the lexicon by people who are interested in using the notion of sexual identity and also gender identity in clinical programs of cure. And the citations are there in the book. It's interesting that in John Money's dissertation, for those of you who have not run across him, Money is one of the people who's very involved in the early clinical origins of transition, what he came to call gender transition. And there's a marvelous footnote in his dissertation, which is in the Harvard Archives, in which he recognizes that he's using the word gender in a new way. Right. He says it's a grammatical term and so on, but I think we can use it to talk about the identity of people as being male or female. And he's not apparently so aware of using the word identity in an unusual sense. And I think that's because a few years before Money is writing, Erik Erikson, the great Freudian psychoanalyst who becomes one of the kind of evangelists of this new notion of identity and the importance of identity, has really claimed the word identity as representing simultaneously the core of the individual and the individual's point of connection with society. Those are.
I think that connection of the individual to society is I think you show how it is in some ways the kind of the cement by which it becomes a paradigm that people of such a range of people kind of cling to, and its troublingness. I mean, it is certainly troubling to have that kind of welding of identity, of personal and social in that way. I mean, it's part of the source of its power. Yeah. We have another question. These identity markers were a source of pride and resilience at particular times of our history, as well as epithets. Are you suggesting that when chronicling the history of movements like MCC, that the simple phrase gay church is not appropriate or useful in the present?
Oh, no, wait, there's two questions there. One is how we use the terms that were used by the people we're writing about historically. And there it does seem to me important, so far as possible, to try to put yourself into the vocabulary of what you're describing. So if a group of people call themselves gay church, And incidentally, if by the word gay they mean to include both men who love men and women who love women and perhaps other folk as well, it's important to use that language. Is the notion of gay church useful now? Boy, I would have to think about that, not so much because of gay, which I don't regard as an identity category necessarily, as because of church. Because I'm probably more suspicious of that term than I am of any of the sexual identity, gender identity categorizations.
That's fair enough. I just want to say to folks, there's a little bit more time for Q&A. If you could put your questions in the actual Q&A instead of the chat, my computer is, the Q&A is superseding the chat, so I can't see all of what's happening in the chat. So that's a little technical note. I'm gonna, oh wait, we have another question here. Somebody asks, I go to an affirming church that has a neurodivergent pastor in training. So is it a neurodivergent church? Which seems to me a complicated question about the practices of the church versus the identity claims of the church and the language claims of the church versus a space that is amenable and accessible and expressive for neurodivergent people. But that's my first thought. Do you have thoughts, Mark?
I'm actually very interested in the use of the term neurodivergent too, as well, because it does seem to me, as the questioner suggests, that we have problems often with difference, and we cover up beautiful, complex gradations of difference under ism terms or diagnostic categories or identity terms. So I wonder if we could maybe try to step behind that labeling and just to recognize that we exist in the middle of complex gradations of human difference of all kind. And can't we learn to live with that?
Yeah. And I think, yeah, it's languages are complicated and what they are used for and how they enable and restrict living experience. I mean, it's what the book is about. I'm going to go to the next question. So much of queer writing in the last decade has questioned visibility and its value. Increased visibility for trans folks has come with increased violence against them, for example. To what extent does working in queer archives and publishing that work have to deal with the danger that might come with making plural, beautiful identities visible?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. It seems to me that all of us who work in queer archives, as in other sorts of archives of stigmatized groups or stigmatized individuals, we have to be aware of the risks that we're taking. I don't mean taking ourselves, there's that too. Obviously, in many academic settings, for example, this kind of work can still get you into trouble. But what I mean is that it's hard to write almost anything out of the queer archives without giving material to merchants of hate who will use that material or can use that material violently. And I also am someone, I'm old, what can I say? I still believe in privacy. I believe that privacy ought to be something that can be chosen and should be respected by others. And so, as I've mentioned, very often also in the archives, when we're dealing with these individual lives to which Foucault testified, it seems to me there's a question about publishing the specific differences of an individual, the specific contours of an individual life that can expose the individual, but also other people in similar situations to violent repercussions. So I thank you for that. I do think that we sometimes pretend, haven't we learned that this is an illusion? We sometimes pretend that we're living in a perfectly enlightened age in which it's possible to speak clearly about sex, gender, and many other things without putting anyone at risk. No.
Do we still dream that dream? I remember dreaming it, but it feels like it's been a minute. Since, I don't know, at least 2016, whatever. Another question. Is there a difference between learning a new language in the archive and learning a new language in the present as the language is being invented around you?
Wow, I'd like to underline that question and to say I'm not sure about the answer. I used to believe that it was because it's a kind of standard view, that it's much easier to learn living languages because you have living speakers around you and you can ask questions and you can practice and be corrected and so on. But language mutation is a very rapid, very individual, scattered. The idea that we ever have an overview of all the speakers of a given language, what would that even mean? Because it would change in 30 seconds. So what I've begun to think is that perhaps we ought to take the humility that we feel before an unfamiliar language in the archives and bring it, as Lynne already suggested, to our conversations with living people. And whether we're dealing with dead people or living people, whether we're dealing with living people next to us or on the other side of the planet, down the street or in our bedrooms, we ought to remind ourselves that human beings are essentially mysterious, and that the idea that we can see directly into another human soul is a great and dangerous illusion.
Yeah. We have another question that is actually related to a question that I had, sort of. Somebody writes, does a rejection of sexual and gender identity mean that we cannot hope for queer ancestors? I wonder what to do with my longings for historical connection and images. I also think that a strategy of homophobic people/institutions is to erase queer history. So I worry that critiques of identity could also lead to a queer historical annihilation. How do you deal with this dilemma? And I would add my own sort of variation on that. You write that your interest in the archive is not in the past, it's in the present and the future. But some of us are called to and call out to those archives for the kind of possibilities that you put into the present and the future. And I wonder if you want to think those observations or questions together.
Let me try to do this quickly because I've got an eye on the clock.
Yeah.
And we want to be courteous. I think one of the things we learn in queer living is that our real most families are families of choice. They're families we build. I think that's true for the past as in the present. In the same way that I don't want the transmission of DNA through certain human bodies to determine where I have to put my loyalties and affections. I also don't want the notion of gay man as a sort of transhistorical reality to determine where I can find my queer ancestors. So I mean, the book, which is mainly about women in terms of the text it studies, is a declaration of my queer ancestry. I'm not sure they want me. Some of them were committed lesbian separatists, but I want them. I claim them as my teachers. And let's all think together about this question of past and present, because I'm finding it harder and harder to draw a clear line between them. I believe with Foucault that much of the history we write is history of the present. But I also believe in what my Buddhist friends tell me about eyebrow to eyebrow transmission, in which you meet a historical teacher eyebrow to eyebrow. and the Dharma is transmitted directly. I've also had that experience in dealing with these texts. My vibration was reading notes by Phyllis Lyon about early meetings with the daughters of Bilitis, reading them through tears, just because I felt this enormous connection. But let me pause there because we are at our time, I think, and
we are. I'm going to
yeah.
close though with a closing quote from the book because I love it and I want people to hear it. And I wish that you could read it in your language, but I have in your mouth, but I have it here on my hand, on my paper, in my mouth. So it would sound better from yours. But I just want to close with this. What we have to work with: candid acknowledgement of mortal incompleteness, historical persecution, dazzling languages almost lost, personal and communal failures in courage or imagination. If we continue to speak, these become so many offerings to desire and so many testimonies of its changeable persistence. My testimony is not that desire remains unchanged in its panting pursuit. On the contrary, it changes, it changes. Change must then be the vocation of any calling that wants to be queer. I learned so much from this book, Mark. I'm so grateful to you for writing it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Lynne and Mark, for provoking thoughts and questions. And I think we just had a sense we couldn't cover all the questions came up, and I'm sure you're initiating conversations. They're going to be continuing for quite a while. So again, thank you. Thanks to all of you who were here and listened and offered comments and questions. Within a few days, you will all be receiving an email with recording tonight's program, so you can listen to this again, and then you can share it with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ RAN website, and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. We have just confirmed that next month's webinar will be 4 weeks from tonight on December 7th, and will be an unveiling of LGBTQ RAN's newest online exhibition. It will be the historical development of BIPOC trans spiritual leadership. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ RAN is the first and foremost source of information on queer religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded primarily through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. A reminder that if you would like to offer personal greetings or a comment to Mark or Lynne, stay here after the webinar concludes. And so we wrap up. On behalf of everyone here, I offer deep, deep gratitude to Lynne and Mark for this thoughtful discussion and learning experience. Good night to you all.